Well, thanks to the Family Research Council and the Robertson School of Government for hosting this event. I literally would have done it anywhere, but I was thrilled when I heard that it was going to be at Cornerstone Chapel. My brother-in-law and sister-in-law are members here, their family worships here, and we have thus worshiped here on multiple occasions when we've come to visit, and I just am always blessed by the musical worship. I love your pastor's preaching. You all have a great church, and thank you for hosting this tonight. So if you look at the history of the term Christian nationalist, what you will find is prior to 2006, no one was using it. Not literally no one, but it was rarely used, and it wasn't used as it's used today. We should be clear about this. Christians were not running around calling themselves Christian nationalists. Christians were not saying we need to advocate for Christian nationalism. Christian nationalism came about really about 2006 as a term of criticism, written by people that were highly critical of what they described as a toxic mix. Americans who wanted to conflate God and country. But that's not all. They're racist, they're sexist, they're militarist. Think of almost every ism or ist that you don't like, and that is Christian nationalism. Now, these early books, a few were written by academics, most were written by popular authors or activists or polemicists who work for places like the Freedom from Religion Foundation. That should maybe give a hint as to where some of these are coming from. And they make some ridiculous arguments. I document some of these. I'll just mention one now. Many of them attribute Christian nationalism to the work of an obscure Calvinist theologian, Rousas Rushdoony, whom almost no one has heard of, who influenced almost no one. Now, they like him because he does say he's a post-millennialist. He says the kingdom of God will advance, and when it advances, societies will become Christian, and they will adopt biblical law. And in these societies, homosexuals will be put to death if they engage in homosexual activity. Men will dominate the church and the state. Incorrigible juvenile delinquents will be put to death, right? Drawing from Levitical passages. And so that sounds really scary, right? Even for Christians, who would want to live in this sort of society? Well, one problem is it's pretty easy to document, and I do this in a publication that will be linked tonight. Really, no one follows Rushdoony. There are a few thinkers that are influenced by a little bit, but really not at all. So this is a flavor of arguments. Now, in 2006 began a dribble of books that came out every couple of years. An article, a book would come out. Things escalated with the January 6, 2021 attack on the U.S. Capitol building. This is, if you follow that at all, Christian nationalists have attacked the U.S. Capitol building. I was flying back from a speaking engagement on January 6th, and I got a message from a reporter who wanted a comment on the Christian images among the rioters at the Capitol riot. And I said, well, I've been flying, send me some. She sent me about 5 images. 3 of them were literally 1.5 miles from the U.S. Capitol. There was a rally that day where Christians came together and prayed to overturn the results of the election, as is their constitutional right. They had some signs and crosses and this sort of thing. They were not necessarily among the rioters. There were far more people there than at the rioters. Well, if you turn to the actual riot, you have the Evergreen State, the Pine State flag, which says on it, an appeal to God. Well, that sounds kind of Christian, and it could be from Judges, but it could also be from Locke's Second Treatise. Or they could have brought it because it's a Revolutionary era flag. The only distinctively Christian photo that they had from the actual riot was a Goth holding a Bible in front of it, in front of the rioters. And so I said to the reporter, you might want to be careful with this narrative. You really haven't sent me much by way of images. She completely ignored my caution, and the headline the next day in the Sojourners magazine article, but everywhere, is again, Christian nationalists have attacked the U.S. Capitol building. If you look at the images from that day, what you will see is a sea of American flags, a sea of MAGA hats, a Confederate flag, a crazy Viking dude. And there eventually it did come out, a Christian flag was there, and a few other images are there. There was a prayer set in the Capitol. So there were certainly some Christians there who thought they were acting as God would have them act, presumably. They weren't. Let's be crystal clear about that. Attacking the U.S. Capitol building, attacking anything really, is never acceptable. Well, since January 6th, and before that, some more serious books have started to come out by academics, people like Andrew Whitehead, Samuel Perry, Phil Gorski, Paul Miller, and others. Now, I take these to be scholars acting in good faith, attempting to measure the phenomenon of Christian nationalism. Now, like the earlier authors, they describe a toxic mix. Racism, sexism, militarism. This is a horrible, scary thing. And I'm kind of terrified if there are, in fact, Americans out there who hold those views. And unfortunately, I'm afraid we all know that there are. I would like to think, and I'm pretty sure it's a really tiny number in rural parts of, other parts of the country. I won't say what part of the country because I don't want to insult any particular region. But they came up with a way of measuring this where they concluded that, in fact, 52% of Americans are either fully supportive or partially supportive of this horrible toxic stew that we call Christian nationalism. Now, this is a scary finding. If over half of American citizens are fully or partially supportive of Christian nationalism, we may be in trouble. Fortunately, their measures are fundamentally flawed. They're really good at measuring whether or not one is a strict separationist. So the questions they utilize involve things like, should religious memorials be permitted on public land? In other words, should the Blandensburg Cross in Maryland, this World War era cross, be permitted? Or should it be torn down, like the American Humanist Association wanted to do? Should the Ohio Holocaust Memorial be permitted to have a Star of David? Or should this be prohibited as a Freedom from Religion Foundation argument? So are you in favor of the strict separation of church and state? Should prayers be allowed in public schools? Or should public schools presumably ban prayers? So again, it's just a very bad set of measures to measure this horrible toxic stew that we call Christian nationalism. I think, and again, I want to assume the authors are acting in good faith, but there's a few lines throughout the book that I think kind of give away the biases, implicit or otherwise. If you are pro-life, you are concerned merely with controlling women's bodies. I wonder if the women in you here who are pro-life know this, and women are just as likely to be fully pro-life as men. I think you could be the most pro-choice American in the entire world and still understand that pro-lifers are concerned with protecting innocent human life. Now, you might think they're wrong, but to accuse them of simply being interested in controlling women's bodies is just wrong. Or they say, these Christian nationalists are attempting to define religious liberty as something more than the freedom of worship. Well, this is news to me as a student of the First Amendment, which begins, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. The First Amendment has always, religious liberty has always meant something more than freedom to worship. We have the freedom to act upon our religious convictions whenever possible. Of course, there are appropriate limits put on this. You don't get to sacrifice a child to the sun god, but we have the freedom to act. And yet, according to Whitehead and Perry, if you try to defend a more robust understanding of religious liberty, you're a bigot. And of course, what they have in mind is Jack Phillips and Barronelle Stutzman and other Christian creative professionals who refuse to participate in same-sex wedding ceremonies. All right, so I think these measures are bad. Now, fortunately, not all sociologists are the same. There are a couple of sociologists at Pennsylvania State that have come out with a recent article, Smith and Adler, I think the names are, which I think have a much more reasonable. I think Christian nationalism is a thing. I'm not going to have time to describe what it is. I assure you it's not this horrible toxic mix that is described by the critics of Christian nationalism. But Christian nationalism does exist, and it is embraced by maybe 20% of the American population. We can perhaps talk about that a little later. Let me mention recently, over the last year, for the first time, Christians have started coming out and embracing the label of Christian nationalism. Marjorie Taylor Greene, for one. There are a couple of academics whom I know who are good, solid Christians, and I assure you they are not racist, they are not sexist, they are not militarist, but they're writing books saying we should embrace Christian nationalism. Let's reclaim Christian nationalism. Christian nationalism is a good thing, and I understand what they mean. And again, I assure you they are not advocating for racism, sexism, the whole 9 yards. They're advocating for the importance of the nation state and their international order, the importance of culture, and this sort of thing. I think this is a very imprudent move. Christian nationalism is a concept, it's a term invented by critics. We should not embrace it. we should just simply identify ourselves as Christians. We are Christians, we are followers of Christ. We have an obligation, a God-given obligation, a biblical obligation to be involved in politics, to be involved in the city, to be fighting for justice, liberty, and freedom for all. That's our obligation, and we cannot fall away from it. But we cannot embrace this term of Christian nationalism. That's just imprudent, and it's handing victories to our critics. Thank you very much.